Yeah, just I was introduced to you, and then I was so my farming experience, Jeff, was with the family corporation, and I grew a lot of crops and did a lot of things with soils, and I've got a science degree from OSU, et cetera, but
Hmm. Hmm.
I didn't know much about any of this, even
Yeah, I
though
don't
I
think.
grew crops for 30 years.
Yeah, I don't think anybody did. I mean, it was Dr. Elaine Ingham and a small group of followers. And I remember we started a listserv. Remember those? Just a group of people talking about compost
Okay.
tea on the internet very early on. And yeah, it was very successful. We really spread the word about compost tea and actively aerated compost tea became a
Hmm.
real word as a result of that and everything else. And I couldn't figure out why every gardener, because at the time I was a garden columnist, and I couldn't figure out why every gardener wasn't understanding the soil food web. And she said, there's no traction. I'm not. And so I offered to write a book about it. I didn't discover the soil food web. I mean, this is Dr. Elaine stuff, and so, yeah, I think that was sort of the beginning. Nobody knew about it. I didn't know about it. I had to research it in order to write the book, and boy, that was a while back, and people have sure changed now, haven't they?
Yes, they have. Jeff, what year was that? That
That
teaming
was
with
well,
microbes.
the book came out in 2006. I remember going with Dr. Elaine to a garden writers conference in Washington State, and I got up and she was there. She was going to speak, and I said, to introduce her, how many people know what a mycorrhizal fungi is? Now, these are all the garden writers and TV people or radio people in the country. Not one person knew what a mycorrhizal fungi was. Now, I didn't blame them because until I met Elaine, I didn't know what one was either. And again, we've seen quite the change in the way things are going. And really, when you look at that group today, I can't think of one person who writes about gardening or does TV or has a podcast has anything to do with anything but organics. We're all organic because I think people understand this is the system, this is how it works. There aren't two systems, there's only one, and this is it. And when we come along with chemicals, we destroy it, and then we have to fix it. So there we are.
And
Right,
here
here
we
we
are.
are.
I keep having
Yeah,
a dog in the
let me
background.
take a
Hold on,
moment for those listening. Yeah, go ahead, Jeff. Yeah. Well, while you're doing that, I'll use this little pause to let everybody know who we're speaking with today. And we've got Jeff Lowenfels on the BioAg podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Johann Buck, and joined with me is my fellow host, Bill Riddle. Not joining us today, unfortunately, is our other co-host, Josh Hedberg. We wish him well. He was not able to make today. And we're going to talk with Jeff all about all kinds of stuff.
Sure, why
His
not?
background, books. We got some exciting news to talk about. You got a new book coming out, and we were just talking a little bit about the history of the first book there. And Bill, you held up for those that are just listening, because we do have the video version, we have an audio version of the podcast. So,
Sure.
Bill, you held up there the first book, I believe, that you wrote, Jeff, Teeming with Microbes. That was the first of 3, soon to be 4 books, right?
Right. Yeah, going from a trilogy. So I used to call myself America's dirtiest lawyer because I wrote a soil book and I'm a lawyer. And then I had a trilogy, and so I became Lord of the Roots because I thought that made sense. And now I actually had to look it up. There is a real word for 4 books on the same subject. It's called a quadrilogy. So there we go. I have a
Makes sense.
quadrilogy of books,
Yeah.
and yeah, that first one was really something when it came out because the publisher didn't really believe what I was writing, and so they called the book in the first edition or the first printing a gardener's guide to the soil food web because it was me. It was my guide. It was a gardener's guide. after the first printing, they did two things. They corrected a serious mistake where I reversed pH. Oh God, on page 47, if you have the first book. But then they changed the title of the book to The Organic Gardener's Guide to the Soil Food Web. And that really made me feel like, okay, we've been accepted, and it's taken off since then. I think the thing's been translated into I don't know, 9 or 10 languages. It's Audible, CDs, Kindle. I mean, it's just. I wish my father was alive to see this because he wouldn't believe it.
Hmm.
He introduced me to organic gardening. He was a big time gardener, really big time. We'd come home from work and he'd put his old clothes on and he'd take care of an 8 acre gentleman's farm. His advertising manager was an interesting gentleman who put my picture on the margarine package. If you Google Happy Boy margarine, you can find my picture. Um, but it turned out he hated the job working for my father and my grandfather in the butter business. And he hated it. And so on the weekends, he would drive around and look for things to do. And one day he comes upon a greenhouse in New Jersey that had beautiful plants. And the rest of the story is this is the beginning of Miracle Grow. And so my father was extremely, the guy quit. He told my father and grandfather, I love you guys, I hate butter. And he became the Miracle Grow guy. And he was really quite something, had quite a bit of influence over my father, but my father met J.I. Rodale, and so there was this little conflict there. And we became organic and stopped spraying our apple trees and all that kind of stuff. But again, during that period of time, nobody had any idea of microbes. Nobody talked about bacteria or fungi unless it was something bad. If you had a fungi or a fungus problem, you had a serious problem, and you sterilized your soil with they had boxes that you could plug in and sterilize your soil. I wrote a column once about how I left that box in New York when I moved to Anchorage and tried to do the same thing in the microwave oven, and my wife still hasn't forgotten. And that was God 45 years ago. So yeah, the whole idea of microbes, Dr. Elaine, we got to take our hats off. I mean, unbelievable. And the soil food web is such a logical system that it's hard to refute, and in fact, you can't refute it. And I think it's not the books themselves; it's the subject matter that excites people because it's so important to everything that we do. Now, like, as an aside, and then I'll stop. I probably made a mistake in calling it Teeming with Microbes, Guide to Soil. If I'd called it something like Paladin comes in with a big horse and the fungus and the micro, some sexier name, it might have gotten a little bit quicker and broader research. There are all these books now on mycorrhizal fungi and the canopy, and there are all these very popular New York Times best-selling books. They're teeming with fungi. They're teeming with microbes. I picked the wrong names. I should have used the word regenerative, et cetera, et cetera. But it's okay. I'm not dying over it by any means.
No, I think it's a great title. I like the teeming with microbes, nutrients, fungi, and
Yeah,
now
had a little
bacteria.
trouble with the yeah, I had a trouble with the publisher on that one too. It kept
Oh,
coming back
really?
teeming, Teem. No, that's not what I'm talking about. I mean, the concept of the soil food web, again, going back to the year 2000, is just so foreign to people. I mean, we really were brainwashed to use fertilizers. Brainwashing maybe is too harsh a word for the farmer, but for the gardener, we were brainwashed. I mean, every weekend you get commercials, and in the springtime, this Scottish guy would yell at you about how you had to fertilize your lawn and put on weed and feed and all this stuff, and just beat up like crazy. And how far we've come now to the idea that no, let the microbes take care of it, and they will, and don't disrupt the system. And the research that's been done on the soil food web since Dr. Elaine's early research, unbelievable. I mean, they now can confirm that if you put chemical nitrogen on your plants, the nitrogen use efficiency gets all messed up. The bacteria that are important for nitrogen production in the soil so that it can go into the roots, the whole thing gets just completely messed up, and you just don't get the same quality of plants, which is what farmers, I think, have come to understand.
Yeah, I can't recall when. Well, yeah, I can. It was probably around 2008, 2009 when I first encountered the soil food web,
Hmm.
and it was one of the talking points. A tablespoon of soil contains how many billions of beneficial
Yeah,
microbes,
right.
and up until that point, I don't recall really hearing that throughout college. In agricultural classes and things like that, it really wasn't tying it all together, right? You hear about the Green Revolution and the promotion of fertilizers and how that changed everything. But then it was like all of a sudden, here's this soil food web, and I knew we were onto something, and I knew that this was going to explode because Monsanto was investigating it,
Yeah,
and I saw these articles about isolating and identifying bacteria, the different strains and microbes, and I thought, well, there must be something here if a big conglomerate like that is looking at capitalizing on it. So things are about to change, and
right.
they sure have.
Yeah, and they're going to change even more. We'll talk about the fourth book, but so when the first book came out, of course, mycorrhizal fungi. Well, the first book was just, to me, it was an ability to put together this thing that was like geometry and everything fit. And if you didn't have the right angle, the theorem didn't work. Yeah, it was just a beautiful, beautiful system. And so I wrote that book. I never thought I'd write another book again. I'm an attorney by training. At the time, I was working with a business partner, Wayne Lewis, whose name is on the book as a co-author. Um, and we were just screwing around, and we were selling soil that had very high microbiology in it. And the guy that discovered this soil laying around in Alaska took some to Dr. Elaine, which is how we heard about Dr. Elaine, and insisted that we go and hear one of her lectures, which we did. And whoa, it was like that was it. Life was different. And again, coming from a family that was so closely associated with the invention of Miracle Grow, and the marketing of Miracle Grow was just a stunner to me. Now, I had re-met Horace Hagedorn, this guy who worked for my father and grandfather when we started Miracle Grow as a garden writer. So, maybe 30 years after he started Miracle Grow, he started coming to the garden writers. We were chemical heads, all of us, and I became good friends with him. And he started to travel up to Anchorage a couple of times a year, and he would do his commercials on my front yard. He would sit there, and gardeners would come in and talk about their gardens and what they were doing, and these things would play on the Super Bowl. I'm convinced he died before Teeming with Microbes came out. I'm convinced had he still been alive when the book came out, we'd have a completely different Miracle Grow. But as it is, Scott's Miracle Grow is the largest purveyor of organics, among the gardening suppliers. So they're getting there. They're getting there,
Yeah.
and they're making a big push into the cannabis business. And if you're in the cannabis business, I'm sorry, if you're not growing organically, you're doing something bad to people's health. So you got to be organic in that realm. So
Yeah,
so anyway,
it's interesting you mentioned that because I've got other
yeah,
questions for you, but I want to hope because I hear a lot of commercial growers are feeling uh, you know the need almost to scale, and through that, it's now they're looking at salt-based fertilizers because they got to drive the price per gallon of inputs delivered to the plants down.
yeah,
And now their yield goes up. But I've worked with some growers, and they're telling me the same thing. Like, yeah, I do this, but yeah, then the smell, the quality's not there. So it's kind of like this battle now, where as they scale and become more commercialized, just like with any commercial crop, now you have to start really focusing on your inputs. You can't throw all of these things out to the crops. Not that they need to. If it was Josh was on here, he would go on and on and on about the organic production of it because he of the three of us the three hosts, Josh knows the most about growing that crop organically. But it's almost like they're in this limbo where they have to scale, and in order to scale, they're using all these other, traditional inputs. Yet
Right.
the quality and
Yes,
doesn't
and it's
seem
a
to
big
quite be
mistake.
there.
Right.
Yeah,
It's a very
seems
big
like it.
mistake. Yeah, this Teeming with Bacteria book is very indicative. The research that they've done, just to quickly talk about, there are bacteria in the trichomes of tomatoes, of anything that has trichomes have bacteria in them. Those bacteria in the cannabis situation are doing a couple of things. One, they're speaking to each other in in uh, metabolites, flavonoids, cannabinoids. So you're getting something from that. Two, they're taking some of the photosynthetic produced energy, the sugars that are made in those trichomes by chloroplasts that are in them, and they're fixing nitrogen literally in the trichome. And as they fix that nitrogen, there's a little reaction going on where, in order to fix the nitrogen, the plant has to reduce the amount of oxygen because you can't fix the nitrogen with too much oxygen. And so the plant, in reducing the amount of oxygen produced, the trichome cells produce cannabinoids. Oh, wait a minute. So now we're getting some pretty interesting correlations. And then you throw in another factor, and that is that the seed of the plant that you put in contains bacteria in the seed shell that jump out into the soil. Some of it jump into the plant, jump out into the soil, and give the plant what it needs. They have corn, 400-year-old species, that have the same bacteria today that they had 400 years ago. Whoa. So if you take, a 400-year-old seed, and then you take the seed that's been grown out of that stuff for 400 years, same bacteria. And it's different than other corn. And if you have a cannabis strain, the bacteria, as we'll talk later on, in that cannabis strain is different for each cannabis strain. This is where the terroir comes from, the taste. So it's all just, you know, this is all because we've got advances in microscopy, and because Dr. Elaine and others tied together these various sciences with the microscopy and came out with this wonderful, sort of new area to look at. So, and there's so much stuff out there. Uh, One day after the first book came out, I was sitting in a restaurant looking at a picture of four women eating spaghetti. And I kept thinking to myself, okay, so I wrote this book about how plants get all these nutrients, but I really only wrote about how these nutrients get into the soil. How do they get inside the plant? And what do they do once they get in there? I never took any botany courses. And so that was the genesis of Teeming with Nutrients, a book I wrote for myself. The Teeming with Microbes I wrote for Dr. Elaine. Um, and I was dumbfounded uh, to learn how plants take in their nutrients, and that it's the microbes in the soil that convert the nutrients into the ion form, that lets them go into these little channels in the cell walls. It was just an eye opener for me as a gardener and a writer, uh, and then to discover that everything in that plant, including the little proteins that are the channels that let these nutrients go into the plant, everything is made inside those cells. Holy whoa. There's 10,000 different kinds of enzymes, and 1,000 of each. And those enzymes are all made inside the cell. The whole thing just became so mind-boggling that it added an element to the whole soil food web, a little mystical uh, craziness as far as I was concerned. And it just really solidified that if you didn't have the microbes, you weren't getting the nutrients put into the right form, and therefore they couldn't go into the plant. When you use chemicals, very often those chemicals are in the right form, in a sense, or there are some microbes that will eventually put it in that right form. But it was an eye opener, just an eye opener. And then, we kept getting more and more information about mycorrhizal fungi. And so the genesis of mycorrhizal fungi was I added a chapter to Teeming with Microbes, which is why it's a revised edition. And as I was doing that, it became pretty clear to me that there was enough information for an entire book, and that growers and gardeners needed to know about this because A, they were destroying the system that these fungi were setting up, and B, we were starting to get commercial availability and where we could actually buy some of these mycorrhizal fungi and use them. And they were very similar in many ways to rhizobia, the nitrogen fixing stuff. So really was very cool. Anyway, it was quite the eye opener. And then, of course, that was the end of my writing as far as I was concerned. Fungi, let's see, bacteria wasn't even in my thought process until I met James White, Dr. James White, who is a really incredible professor, like Dr. Elaine, one of these incredibly charismatic, terrific people. At Rutgers University. And Dr. James picked up some research from a woman in Australia about 2010. She invented a word, I pronounce it rhizophagy. Rhizo meaning the root, phagy meaning eat. So root eating. Some people say rhizophagy. There's a whole bunch of different ways to pronounce it, but it's rhizophagy, Rhizophagy. What she
Yeah,
thought was
we
happening.
had James on our podcast, our last
Oh,
episode.
okay.
Yeah,
So you
but
know.
I heard you on a recent podcast explain rhizophagy. So for those that maybe haven't listened to our interview with Dr. James White, why don't you explain that to us?
Sure.
Because you said something like, "I didn't do the research, but I'm the reporter," and let me tell you that your explanation of it's just like your books, very easily digestible. See what I did there?
Good.
Rhizophagy, digestible. Yeah. So
Digestible.
please,
Yeah.
tell
Yeah.
us about that.
Well, so this was a new discovery and really perfected by Dr. James and his students. And again, I just have to take my hat off. I wish I was younger. I'd go to Rutgers University and I would just hang around that guy's lab. Oh my God, the stuff he did. And he's a mycologist on top of everything else. But in any case, under this rhizophagy system, let me back up a second. The system that we all learned from Dr. Elaine and from Teeming with Microbes is a farming system, as far as I'm concerned. What happens is the plant puts these exudates out into the soil like it's a fertilizer. And they attract the bacteria and the fungi who eat this fertilizer. That's terrific. And then along come the protozoa, parameciums and amoebas, which we studied in 10th grade. Nobody understood why. And bacteria, which we tried to study in 10th grade. Nematodes, which we would study in 10th grade if we could see them all the time, but they weren't always there. So these nematodes and protozoa eat the bacteria and the fungi. They get what they need out of it, and then they poop out the excess right there in the rhizosphere. And those molecules, those nutrients, are moved into the plant either by direct contact when the root hits it, or by water flow, mass flow, bringing these chemicals to the root surface itself, or by mycorrhizal fungi going in between the plant cells and then bringing the nutrients in, or even by these rhizobia that cause a root hair to curl around itself and ties up the oxygen and they produce nitrogen. So all of these systems work. I call it the diffusion system. It's not really diffusion, but it moves. There's a movement into the soil, all because the farmer plant is putting this exudate out there. What Dr. James talks about, this rhizophagy cycle, is ranching. So we've got the plant acts as a farmer, but he's also got corrals and ranching capabilities on the same farm property. And what happens is the plant the root sends out a little signal to some of these bacteria that are sitting there right in the rhizosphere, having been attracted by these exudates. And the signal tricks the bacteria into thinking that there is a brand new, completely empty slime house which it can move into and not have to compete with all the other people in the slime that is colony that it's currently in. And so it gets this smell, which happens to be the same smell that you get when you get rancid butter. I know that smell well. I worked for my father in the butter business for a long time. I never thought I'd have a use for that smell, but it's butyric acid, and it causes these guys to back up, and it touches the meristem cell, these brand new cells at the root tip. So it touches the meristem cell, and the next thing you know, it's inside the meristem cell wall. It's not all the way into the cell cytoplasm. It's in this space between the cell wall and the protoplasm, which is held in, or the cytoplasm, which is held in by a membrane. Now, I always tell people at this point in time, think about a tofu container from the supermarket. So the container itself, that plastic, that's the cell wall. The tofu floating in that water inside, that's the cytoplasm with a membrane around it. The watery stuff that's between the tofu and the cell wall, you with me so far? That's called the periplasmic space in terms of this meristem cell. And the bacteria go in there. Now, and I said bacteria, you're probably thinking, a couple of 2 or 3 little things move in there and then move in. When I say bacteria, you should be thinking the cars at Hartsfield Atlantic Airport, or the Denver Airport, or the Phoenix Airport, wherever we're talking mega numbers, not 1 or 2. It's not your driveway cars. And these bacteria move in. And when they move in, there's a little protein that is in the tofu cell wall there, the tofu part, and it sprays this very oxygenated stuff. It's actually called RO onto the bacteria and strips off their cell walls. This is like a really strong, and it strips off the cell walls of the bacteria, which contain nutrients, and those nutrients go into the plant. They're absorbed there in that meristem cell, and so the plant is feeding itself from these bacteria. Now, the bacteria don't like this. And so, in order to reduce the impact of this spray, they go, hey, screw this. I'm going to fight back. And so they use some of the exudates literally to do 2 things. One is they produce ethylene. Ethylene causes the cell to begin to stretch out a little bit. 2, they produce a nitrite. And the nitrite is something that acts as an antioxidant and causes this RO to weaken. And so the RO weakens and the bacteria is able to live. It doesn't get destroyed by this RO. Now, all of a sudden, there's motion that's going on in this liquid. It's circulating. And the bacteria don't have a cell wall on them anymore. Bacteria multiply every 20 minutes when they have a cell wall. Now they don't have a cell wall, it's probably even quicker. They continue to multiply. They're not dead. They're what are called L forms. They don't have a cell wall, but they're still there. And they circulate around that little liquid stuff in the tofu area. And they keep producing the ethylene and the nitrate. This nitrite, the nitrite is then converted by the plant to nitrate and is absorbed by the meristem cell, and up to 30% of the nitrogen of the plant can come from this internal nitrogen fixing that's going on in the plant. But there's more, because the ethylene causing the thing to stretch, you get multiplication, you get these L forms, and this outside or the inside of the outside cell wall is not smooth. So some of the bacteria get caught up on it. And they're caught up on it and they begin to accumulate and they're producing ethylene. And all of a sudden, they cause a tube to pop out of that meristem cell. It's part of the cell. It's got the same cell wall, but it's a little tube extrusion. That is the beginning of a root hair. It's caused by the ethylene from the bacteria. And lo and behold, a little tidal wave occurs down at the bottom, and it shoots these bacteria out of the root hair into the soil where they grow back their cell walls, and then they renutrify themselves. They go back in and repeat this trip again. That's ranching. So the plant farms the stuff that's in the soil. Some of it takes in, shears off the wool, cuts up a couple for pork chops, and puts the rest back out into the corral where they grow back their wall and they reproduce their pork chop, and they go back through this trip again. Holy moly! And the photographs of it was just like Dr. Elaine's stuff. I mean, all of a sudden we could see things that we never saw before. Well, Dr. James and his students have done the staining work that shows you the nitrite and the CO2. It is unbelievable. And it's a real extension to the soil food web. In fact, you have to think about what might have come first. Were the bacteria that are eaten by the nematodes and the protozoa just extra that didn't happen to make the trip into the meris? Who came first? I don't know whether one has to come first, but so you've got that going on, and then some of these bacteria move into the plant through cuts or through a root axis. There's a little area they might be able to get in as a branch is formed, and they move throughout the plant, and they do all sorts of stuff. So when the plant sprays that RO, for example, it has to sit back for a second and go, whoa, wait a minute, I got to be careful. I don't want to destroy my own cell wall. And so it strengthens itself. These bacteria have the capability, when they move throughout the plant, to produce what are known as phytohormones. So gibberellic acids and auxins and all sorts of things that make the plant perform in different ways, always better. Leaf drop, fruit formation, wall thickness, and the bacteria are causing the plant to stimulate and create these wonderful things for itself. And eventually, some of these bacteria end up in the flower and get encased in the seed so that they can do the same thing for the next generation of plants. Wow. And the implications of this are pretty important, I think, as a grower. I mean, if you're growing cannabis, don't sterilize your seeds anymore. Not a good idea, because it turns out, first of all, you don't get this quantity of bacteria. I don't think you normally completely sterilize it unless you use a little bit better system than hydrogen peroxide. But you don't get root hairs if you don't have these bacteria. We were taught that root hairs are there for nutrient uptake. Well, that may be what happens after the bacteria leave, but when they're young and forming, they're there to put the bacteria out into the soil. So if you don't have the bacteria producing the ethylene, you don't get the roots. You get a screwed up plant. You might get one root or something, and it's amazing how simple it is. So if you start your seeds in a paper towel, which many people do, well, then you take the seedling and you put it down in your soil. Wait a minute. You left all the bacteria that are sitting in the paper towel. You better plant that paper towel too. You collect seeds. When do you collect seeds? How do you collect the seeds? Do you let the seeds mature and ripen? How do you store your seeds? Do you store your seeds where they can get oxygen? Because these bacteria need oxygen. Or do you dry them out? Because somebody a long time ago said, yeah, you got to dry those seeds out, which is not a good idea because that doesn't treat the bacteria well. So all of these things are things we need to be thinking about. And then, of course, you add on the fact that, and in the book, it was conjecture because I wrote the book 3 years ago, and you have to go through the process of publishing it. All the stuff that Dr. James and his students have come up with regard to the trichome, we were guessing about back then. Now they got it. I mean, they know that bacteria are coming out of the cells that hold that little trichome ball and doing all sorts of stuff. It's mind-boggling. So again, hats off to Dr. Lane, and now hats off to Dr. James as well, because this is really quite something, and it is going to be a big difference. It reinforces the idea that you don't want to rototill. It reinforces the idea that you don't want to put down chemicals that are going to impact that bacterial situation. And it reinforces the idea that something's here because the Monsantos of the world clearly are watching this and are already acting in producing endophytic bacteria, which is what these things are called. They're endophytic, they're inside, that perform endosymbiosis. They are symbiotic with the plant. It turns out that not every bacteria works the same way with every plant, so you got to find the right plants to do the right bacteria. But we're going to be able to fix bacteria in parts of the plant that are important, in addition to the stuff that's going on in the root. And we're going to be able to stop using chemicals. It's coming. We already have the database for the bacteria. We should be able to do what Dr. Elaine did, which is go around the world and find where the best bananas are growing and check the microbiology in that soil. Where's the best wheat growing? Check the microbiology in that soil, and then replicate it. It's coming, and I think it's going to come down to the point. I don't know if you had Dr. Judith on talking about the microbiometer. Unfortunately, she passed away, Judith Fitzpatrick. But we're going to be able to do this stuff with our cell phone. I'm convinced it's coming. And between Apple,
we were unable to get her on before she passed. I did meet her once though, before
wonderful.
early when she first formed Microbiometer. I remember this woman in the back of a room at a conference, and she had posed this question about something, and I went back after the seminar was over, and I chatted with her a little bit. She was going. She had a sample of the microbiometer and told me what she was doing. I thought, wow! I said the industry needs this, and I wish you well. And then lo and behold,
yeah. Well, and the industry does need it, and for those that don't know what we're talking about, these microbes do something that's measurable. And what people used to do, they would come to me and they would say, "We want you to endorse our product," and I would say, "Well, show me how it works. Prove to me that it's teeming with microbes." Some people could, but it wasn't that easy to do. And along comes Dr. Judith Fitzpatrick, and she had this gadget that measured microbiomass. Now, when your plant is performing well, the biomass increases. When your plant is under stress, the biomass doesn't increase and sometimes actually decreases. And so, if you can measure this various times during the course of your grow, whatever it is, or even before you start, you can determine whether what you're doing is helping your plants teem with microbes, the biomass is going up, or not. And when you have a certain number using the biometer, which she invented and which you read off your cell phone, when you get the right number, you no longer have to give any food to your plants because the biomass is high enough that the plant you can be assured that the plant's going to get enough food. There's enough cycling going on in the organic material. So the microbiometer, www.microbiometer.com, the company's still in business. She just died about a month ago, unfortunately. It is truly a wonderful instrument. So if for example, you're using one of the BioAg, you're putting down, some humics, you can tell 3 or 4 weeks later whether that stuff's helping. I'm telling you, it is helping, but you can prove it to yourself. Wow, this is really, really nice to have available. So, yeah.
Sure is. I do have a question. So the rhizophagy cycle, everything you were just explaining, I don't think we've talked too much about your book that's coming up. It is called Teeming Bacteria, and I think the rhizophagy cycle is is like a subhead or subtitle
Yeah,
of the
yes.
book.
Teeming with, let's see if I can remember it. Teeming with is a mouthful. Teeming with Bacteria, the Organic Gardener's Guide to Endophytic Bacteria and the Rhizophagy Cycle. Very
And
long
that comes
title.
out it's available for pre-order, but it releases later
Right.
this month, correct?
Yes. It releases on the 27th of the month. And it's a different kind of book. It's the same kind of book as the other teaming books. The difference here is that we're dealing with a ubiquitous organism or ubiquitous organisms that have very hard to pronounce names. And so how do you get that across? And what I try to urge readers to do is just don't get hung up on them. By the time you get to the end of the book, some of them will be familiar. What I wanted to make sure was that we had a reference so that when we actually do end up getting the ability to be able to send in, we can already send in the soil sample and they can tell you what's in that soil from a bacterial RNA, DNA situation. It's a little expensive, but it's going to get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. Um, I wanted people to be able to look that up and understand. I wanted people to be able to understand that there is a different bacterial mix in vermicompost as opposed to thermal compost. And as a result, you can use it for different plants and get different results. We need to do those experiments. But if I was a farmer, that's one of the things I'd be doing right now. Some plants do better with the bacteria types that are in vermicompost than in thermal compost. Who knew? Well, Dr. James has stimulated that thought in my mind, and I hope I'm able to stimulate that thought in other people's minds. And there are also now organisms you can buy that seem to be helpful for certain crops. So I noticed that cannabis growers are buying uh, azospirillum, which is a bacterium that occurs in different forms around the world. They discovered one in Brazil that really helps wheat grow, and that one seems to help cannabis grow as well. Interesting stuff, very interesting stuff, and I think going to be very useful. Although it's a little bit more complicated because we're not our brains were not trained to think bacteria, either the size of them, numbers of them, or how to pronounce their names. We know more about dinosaurs, unfortunately, than we do about microbes. So,
Yeah, I was gonna bring that up. I remember you saying that on
yeah,
one of your recent interviews that we grew up when we know all kids know all these different. Yeah, he knows all the dinosaur names. Yeah,
yeah,
or she, your child, these children who really get into dinosaurs.
yeah.
Uh,
What
but
useless
yeah,
information?
eventually we'll yeah we will understand and we'll recognize the different strains and species and
Or
of bacteria and such.
somebody will come along with a strip that you can put in to your corn, a corn strip that if it turns red, it's got the right bacteria. If it doesn't, those things have got to be coming because we've only got 60 years of soil left. At the bottom line of all of this stuff is soil structure. And these microbes create that soil structure. And when we lose that soil structure with conventional farming, because either the mechanical turnover of the soil or the chemical destruction of the soil food web, we don't get soil structure. 60 years left. A couple of days ago, I saw something in the newspaper. Uh, there was a dust storm in Arizona. Wonder why? That had to have been an agricultural situation, and if we're not careful, we're not going to have soil left. I don't know about you. I don't want to live off of hydroponics, frankly. Uh,
Yeah, I
so
think the answer, my personal opinion is the answer is all of the above.
right,
All of the above. It's going to take everything: field, greenhouse, vertical farm. It's going
yeah,
to be a combination thereof. And in those systems, I think they need to learn to use bacteria and
fungi, yeah,
there. I think there is where you have kind of a battle. The mentality you got to keep it sterile. You have to add your quaternary ammonia, and you got to keep
yeah,
things clean and sterile. Yet I always say kind of created this saying: the only thing missing from soil is agriculture is the soil, and people will kind of like, well,
Yeah.
duh.
I always
Well,
say,
you understand what I'm saying here: the microbes, the microbiome, and how important that is not only to the plants but to us. That's the other
right.
thing is we consume those plants. The plants have the endophytes in them. They get into our system. We benefit from them as well. It's one big.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
a
and it's
reciprocal.
interesting. They operate the same way. They back into uh, David Monk. I don't know if you know David Montgomery. He wrote the Hidden Half of Life or something. Anyway, it was he and his wife wrote this wonderful book about they were converting their Seattle property to organic yard, and she got cancer, and so they sort of veered off, and then there was a connection between the soil food web and the bacteria in your stomach back into the intestines and get into your system the same way they get into the root with the butyric acid. It's the same with a fake. It's just crazy, crazy stuff. Um, yeah, it just blows my mind, and we never even think about this stuff. It's just,
Yeah, it's all pretty fascinating.
but
I've
we'll
been,
get there. But we'll get there. What I
yeah,
tell people, you've got your saying. What I tell people is, okay, hold it a second. You don't believe this stuff? Look at the redwoods. You ever put Miracle Grow on them? Who puts Miracle Grow on those things all the time? Nobody. How'd they get that big? It's the microbes. That's how they did it. And then you go one step further. Dr. Elaine tells a story about how the redwoods were all beginning to die, the ones that were being looked at by people. And the reason was the traffic was causing foot traffic as well as car traffic was causing the mycorrhizal fungi to die. Putting all you had to do was back people off, put the barrier up, and boom, the plants come back. Well, that ought to convince people there's something going on here that makes an awful lot of sense. The problem is, it's very hard to convince a farmer that's making money or maybe breaking even, not losing money, that a new system is going to be better, and therefore stop what you're doing. Take this risk. Who wants to? You lose a season, you take that risk, you're screwed. But in fact, this is how we grew everything before chemicals. This is how we'll grow everything after chemicals. And you're right. There's a reason why Monsanto's studying all of this stuff. They are looking at microbes up the yin and down the yang in order to become the supplier of all of this stuff because the stuff they're selling now not going to sell.
yeah, and I think that I think there's some good. There won't be one single company, obviously, out there that's going to rule over everything.
Right.
But I think if it helps reduce the dependence on harsher chemicals and it increases softer chemistry and helps improve soil, hey, great, get after
Good
it.
on them. I agree.
Spend more time on the endophytes and less
Yeah.
time on some of these other things, right?
Well, and they
And
are, and in many ways, they're almost. I wouldn't say they're easier to study, but I mean, the fertilizer. We know what fertilizer is. We know what the formulations are. I don't think they're changing them very much, other than taking out the phosphate from lawn fertilizers because we're running out of phosphate. But this microbial stuff is fascinating stuff and has the potential, as BioAg knows, of just changing the way people can grow plants. I mean, Vic is involved in a little project right now involving a fungi that does some pretty interesting Vic of BioAg that does some pretty interesting stuff. So it's coming. It's coming. And it's welcome. I mean, nobody wants to use these chemicals really when you think about it. And when you understand, and there'll be cartoons, and we will get kids to understand. There are already now plush toys of microbes. We'll get people to understand and to move beyond the old agricultural way of doing stuff. And in many ways, we are. I mean, look at all the books on mycorrhizal fungi that are out there right now. These New York Times bestsellers that have better titles than my book. They're sexy, and people read it, and every time somebody reads one of those books, good on them. I don't care whether it's mine or theirs. They put the book down. They understand what's going on, what we're doing, how it's impacting climate change, how it's impacting nutrient density, how it's impacting the flavor of their cannabis or their strength of their cannabis. All of this stuff is ties together, and they're there. So we'll get there. We'll get there, I think. As long as we don't
I think so
become,
too.
no, this it's funny too because we haven't really become politicized in a way that so much of our other day to day life things have become politicized. Um, we don't have a conservative and a red and a blue. If you're into growing stuff, it's the soil food web. That's the way to grow. I don't care what you call it. That's how it works. Period. There is no alternate truth. That's just how it works. Period.
Yeah. I think there's a little bit of that within agriculture when uh, between the different production systems, whether it's regenerative, organic, conventional,
Yeah.
controlled environment agriculture, and which is why I say, hey, let's let's not end up like every other freaking issue known to man and
Right.
politicize it. Let's figure out, okay, there's enough room for everybody here, and it's going to take all of these systems to feed the growing planet.
Yeah. Right.
And, I live in Arizona, and at one point where I lived, this valley was highly agricultural. It's not that way anymore. Water, residential homes, things like that. Well, where does all that arable land is now unproductive. And
Right.
so we're going to need to have those systems and controlled environments where it may not be hospitable to growing plants outside, yet we're also at the same time, we have to rebuild soil. We have to get more yield and higher quality, maybe more important, off the arable land that we have now. So it's like, let's figure out how to, work together on this
Right.
versus
Right.
saying, those dirty farmers, or, this, that, or the other. Like, well,
Right.
we can figure
Yeah,
this
I
out.
mean, you're right. I mean, and it doesn't have to happen right away either. I mean, it can be phased in. I mean, you get farmers to start using BioAg products. They don't have to use them all at once. They get they get hooked. Sooner or later, they'll get hooked. And then, of course, the demand is there. People want organics. Either they don't want to live in an area where herbicides and pesticides are being used. None of us, I don't know anybody who wants to eat pesticides and herbicides and does it purposely. We just don't. I mean, look at the growth of the organic section of the food stores, and it's really quite amazing. And now with people talking about vertical farming and those kinds of things, and even at home systems, which have stumbled, and people are trying to get them going, and some of them are a little hydroponic-y and a little too complicated, but we're getting there. There are an awful lot of people that are turning their lawns into gardens and food, and um, and that are, at least when they have a lawn and live in Arizona, they're trying to be organic about it. Uh, it's a tough slog though. That's why we write these books.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's why they get translated. The other day, I ran into the publisher. I'm down in Oregon this week. I ran into the publisher of Timber Press, which is my. They've been bought out several times, but they're my publisher. And he said, "Oh, I was just I and what a coincidence. I mean, I just bumped into him. What are the chances of that?" And he said, "Hey, it's funny. I just left the office. I saw on someone's desk a German copy of one of your books. He didn't know what it was, and it was a CD. So they got somebody sitting there who translated the book and read it. Oh my God! The Turkish Department of Agriculture asked whether they could do the book. Oh, that's
Fantastic.
pretty incredible.
What a compliment.
Yeah, it's fun. It's fun. I had a classmate who at college who dropped out and because of the Vietnam War and ended up becoming a very famous organic gardener advisor in Vietnam. He went over there and instead of fighting, he went over there to grow stuff, and he died. And somebody asked whether they could publish the book on the internet in Vietnamese, so that Vietnamese people, and how much would I charge? And so I didn't charge anything. We dedicated it to this guy John Barlow, and so they're using this system around the world. And again, sometimes I get the credit. No, 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 no. This is Dr. Elaine. This is Judith Fitzpatrick. This is Dr. James. These people came up with the research that proved that we've been doing things wrong. And that's the other thing. It's very hard to admit you're doing things wrong. Generations and generations of farmers have been tilling that soil like crazy, and convincing themselves that that's the only way to go. All of a sudden you're going to say what your dad told you to do was wrong. That's hard to swallow sometimes. So, yeah, it's a kind of a strange world.
It is. Bill, you got some questions there? I've got some other ones I want to kind of segue into some other areas because Jeff lives a very exciting life here. He's done a lot of things. I want to know if you have
hardly
questions.
shut me up, as you can tell. Yeah.
I
love it.
I have so many questions, and Jeff, what you talked about, multi-generational farms. My efforts now are in ag to communicate the message of the soil food web and seeing the bigger picture. It's tough.
Yeah.
It's really tough. But again, like you said, no farmer has ever intentionally screwed up his soils.
Yeah.
Okay. That's a fact. But oftentimes you share about what soil microbe activity, the soil food web, and a farmer will look at you just cross-eyed. What are you talking about?
Yeah,
I've
right.
got my soil tests. pHs are good. Available nutrients are good. Crops look good. We're not going to. Why would I invest in that?
Yeah.
In
Yeah.
the new system?
Because
So that's my
ultimately it
question
becomes
for you.
cheaper. It becomes cheaper ultimately, I think. As long as you recognize the law of return, which is what farmers violate all the time because we harvest stuff. What falls from a plant when a plant dies is supposed to decay right there and return to the soil. That's how the redwoods do it. I mean, the stuff falls down, it decays, the microbes decay it, the microbes go back into the root system, blah blah blah, go through the rhizophagy. To convince a farmer that if you're able to put back organic material and don't have to buy the chemicals and don't have to monitor for pests the same way because as you use those chemicals, you change the plant's defense system and weaken it ultimately. There's got to be a spreadsheet that shows you at some point in time it becomes cheap enough so that in your lifetime you can make that switch and survive. Why corporate farmers don't do it, I can't figure out. I mean, it seems to me that isn't there a premium to buying organic, to selling organic? I mean, when I go into the store, I pay extra for organic because it's worth it to me. That's the other thing. It seems to me that ultimately you end up with probably a little bit better payday if you're doing it organic. But I'm not a farmer; I don't know. Maybe competition.
And the produce you're talking about. So look at the big scale acres, the Midwest, our corn soy system that's been in place. I think it's a really bad idea, and it has been a bad idea. The livestock have been removed.
Right.
Annual farming, annual cropping. That system is so beautiful, set up for livestock and a cycling soils, not tilled. And some farmers are getting it. They're getting it. They're using covers. They're doing no till. But many of the crop you just talked about produce, you buy organic. Great, so do we. But that's a pretty tiny part of ag, especially U.S. ag. The bigger part is the corn soy monster.
It is.
And
And you're
feeding
right.
livestock in confined spaces. And
What
that's
about green markets? What about carbon sequestration and the carbon credit markets? You think?
Well, now you're going to get political, though, right, Jeff?
Right,
We're going to get political with all the carbon stuff.
Not necessarily. It's whether you agree or disagree with the carbon credit, but if there's a system available to farmers to say, hey, if I increase carbon in my soil, which is a benefit, as Jeff brought up earlier, how do you incentivize growers to do this? There's other benefits as well, reduction of pesticides and healthier plants, so on and so forth. But also, if it opens up another revenue stream for them.
Right. And there are some groups starting to do that, Johann. They're not to scale yet. This regen soil, there's some certifications you can do with that. But how do I motivate my farmers to get headed down this path?
Boy, it's so hard to do. And again, I mean, they have to feel, that it's worth it. And if they're not, it's in some instances, it's their own health they ought to be thinking about, depending on what they're using, of course. But you're right. I mean, that's the hard thing. It's easy with gardeners. It's really easy with gardeners.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a small space. They're not making money off it. They're not relying it on their living. Much harder as you get bigger and bigger and bigger. You're absolutely right. It's a big scale. And maybe what we have to do is we have to legislate it. Whoa, then you're getting political for sure.
Well,
and there's more of them than us in terms of lobby capabilities. But what'll happen is it'll be a top-down situation. So let's take again. I keep picking on Monsanto. We could be picking on Bayer or whatever. Any of these, and there's about 8 or 9 of these big chemical companies that are all producing and currently selling organic endophytic bacteria, endophytic fungi. They're doing the right stuff. It'll be a top-down situation. Either people will get so sick with glyphosate, or there'll be a direct proof that it's bad. All of a sudden, you got to give a new system to the farmers, and I don't think the system that the Monsantos of the world are going to give the farmer to replace the glyphosate system, the Roundup system, where we spray everything. It's going to be biological. You can just feel the change coming, and it will come. So I think maybe the answer to your question is it'll be top down. Something will happen that'll cause the companies that supply these things to make the conversion. They'll either be making more money off of it, it'll be an easier situation, or they'll have a better competitive edge over their competitors. Something will happen from a top-down situation, so we can start there. From a bottom-up situation, consumers can complain. We do complain. We haven't really been all that successful, other than getting a little bit of an organic label, and even that people are beginning to fool around with. So maybe it has to be a top-down.
Also, finding the early adopters. I spent a lot of time in controlled environment agriculture, and I had one grower. Congratulate him. He recently won Grower of the Year, and he, over the past couple of years, has really jumped on the biological approach. And this is for containerized ornamental crops. And he has, at least on 1 or 2 crops, all but eliminated the use of fungicides by going biological, using a lot of endophytes, using biostimulants like fulvic acids, and supplementing with silicon, and how important that is to the whole system and to all living cells, right? Not just the plants, but also the microbes, and tying that all together. And what he's doing is catching on. So there's another example of bottom up, where growers are saying, "Hey, this stuff might be a little bit more expensive, but I eliminated my fungicides, I can also use less fertilizer. I've cut my fertilizer rate. Traditionally have been told, and over the years have used 200 parts per million of nitrogen. I've cut it down to 80. So I've got all this excess fertilizer sitting in my warehouse, right? And that's going to catch on. Other growers are going to be like, okay. And then the companies that offer those are going to be like, I'm losing revenue. I didn't sell as much fertilizer this year. What went wrong? Maybe I ought to start looking at some of these endophytes and get in that game."
Right. Yeah. Again, but that's a top down, bottom up kind of situation where one stimulates the other. It's very hard to convince, for example, cannabis growers, commercial cannabis growers. No, you need to be organic. They don't think it's possible to grow organically indoors. Of course it is. course, it is in containers. A plant's a plant, and it's the plant that's in control. Of course, we screw things up. We're the people that mess it up, but the plant's in control, and you can do this stuff anywhere that the plant can grow. Uh, I spent a part of a day at NASA talking to them about they were growing, talking about their plant growth situation, and what I related to them was that one day I was sitting in my office, Teeming with Fungi had just come out, and an astronaut walked into my office. He'd been doing some stuff up in Alaska, terrain stuff or something. And we talked about he wanted to grow plants. He ended up writing a little blog from space, pretending that the plant was writing the blog. And he was trying to figure out what medium he could use to grow plants using sort of a soil food webby system. And we came up with the idea of using some of his diapers. They wear diapers up there and whatnot. But what was interesting was that the plants that they were growing, they tried plants, and the ones that worked were the ones that did not need mycorrhizal fungi. So they were growing cold crops. I forget what it was, cabbage or kale or something of this. And, yeah, sure, it grew great. Didn't need mycorrhizal fungi, didn't need quite the same soil situation. What happens when they had to really sort of think about it. Their constraint, of course, is weight. They don't care whether it's chemical or organic, as long as it's very light, so that they can get up into space. Um, so even when you study this stuff and you know that there's a reason why certain things happen, you've got other constraints. And again, we've got to help farmers in that regard. They got payments, or they just finished paying off the big tractor that does the rototilling. Of course, they're going to use it. It's very hard to. No, that thing sits idle. Don't use that anymore. You got to go get a motherboard, a motorboard situation. Very tough. It's very, very tough. Now, I have to tell you, when I wrote my books, I did not write them for farmers. I wrote them for gardeners, and it was a stunner to discover that so many people who were doing professional growing were using the systems in the book. Ooh. The first time I went to the Emerald Cup, uh, I was stunned at how many people had the book. And said, "Hey, wait, can I get your autograph?" You're like, "What?" Growers, wow. And I think as you were indicating, I mean, you give them a copy of the book and you get them to read it. And now that it's in audio, they can sit in their tractor with a thing in their ears and just listen to it. It, it. The system is just too beautiful. It fits together too nicely for people not to end up believing it. And once you're exposed to it, you got to believe it. And once you believe it, got to be thinking about what you're doing to your soil. Uh, and again, we started to talk about structure. It ultimately all comes down to that soil structure. Those bacteria produce a slime. Those fungal hyphae weave together those slime together aggregates of soil. They're not bricks. They're not flat, so they don't fit together tightly. They have spaces between them so that you get pore spaces where little guys can hide from the bigger guys, et cetera, where water can accumulate. So you got reservoir spaces where air can accumulate, uh, and where the soil can stick to itself instead of blowing away. And when you abandon the soil food web, when you don't team with microbes, that's what happens. And you end up losing that soil structure. Your plants might still grow, but you've got a bad situation, and ultimately you are gonna have to replace that soil. So
Before you wrote these books, you write a garden column, a weekly
right.
column for the Alaska Dispatch? Is that the
No,
name
it's
of the
it's called
paper?
the Anchorage Daily News.
Anchorage
Uh,
Daily News. Okay.
Right, right. And I always tell people I've been writing this column now 47 years, 46, 47 years, and I don't miss a week. I always submit one because when you go away, they put your picture in the paper. You've all seen it. Hey, Jeff will be back. He's on vacation. He'll be back in 2 weeks. To me, that always said rob his house. And so I always have a column And so I'm the longest running consecutive garden columnist in the world, maybe even columnist. And I write these columns because I like to write, but they started out as letters to my father, who taught me how to garden, and they just sort of took a life, and I just love, as a lawyer, I'm retired now, but being able to walk around Anchorage and go to a supermarket instead of somebody coming up to me and going, "You dumb lawyer," they say, "Oh, hi, Jeff. Can I ask you a gardening question?" It's a nice. Everybody gardens. I'm sorry, I don't. Other than the organic versus non-organic, you can't have politics. There's no Trump Biden divide in gardening. Everybody's alike, and we like each other, and we should. And if we're not, then you're not a real gardener, right? And we share. I got to put in a little plug for Plant a Row for the Hungry. Whether you're a farmer or whether you're a home gardener, and whether you've read my books or not, you should at least have one small container or one row in your garden, and you should be in charge of it and take that food to somebody who needs it. Church, synagogue, food bank. There are people in your neighborhood that are going hungry, and you can help that situation. Hopefully, you're giving them food that's been grown from a soil food web perspective, so that it's nice and
Oh, I'm glad you
organic.
brought that up. I was going to ask
Yeah,
you to explain that Plant to Row for the Hungry because I know I saw
yeah.
that in your signature block, and I also saw it in a bio that I read.
Yeah. I was on an airplane trip coming back from a trip to Washington D.C. where it was so cold they had closed the airport for a week. All the restaurants were closed except to people who were tourists. And I went to eat, and a guy came up to me while I had my hand being warmed in my pocket, with the money in both hands, I had hands in my pockets, and he wanted some money to eat, and they tell you in DC, don't do that. Don't give panhandlers money. And so I didn't. And I had some bad dreams that night, I can tell you. So when I finally went home, sitting in first class because the company was paying for the trip, eating steak and zucchini, man, I felt pretty bad about it. And I came up with the idea of writing a column that all my readers should plant one row and help me assuage my my conscience and feed the hungry. And it took off. And so it's a great program, and I hope everybody does it. Particularly now, we've got some serious problems heading our way in terms of food and prices and costs and whatnot. So, got to be done.
Yeah.
Uh,
And not just, I mean, everywhere. I don't know if either of you following what's going on in the Netherlands. I've just been reading how,
oh yeah,
because of the energy costs in Europe, and Netherlands, for those that don't know, they're like the second largest exporter of food in the world, and they're no longer the country's no larger than Maryland, and they're the
right,
second largest exporter
right.
of food in the world. And there are greenhouses, both food and flour, they're not producing this winter.
Yeah,
Energy
part of
costs too
it's
high. They're
energy,
shutting
and
it down.
right, and then they compounded by the fact that they changed some of their regulations, which
Right.
I think they've just changed back, which caused some of the farmers to get really angry. Yeah, one day I get this email from it's in Dutch. I go, what the heck is this? They wanted so the books are all over there, and I got to tell you what, it sounds funny in Dutch. Uh, that is one tough language. Um, I would love to go there and wander around and see how they
It's
grow their stuff.
fantastic. Yeah, you really should. Yeah,
Yeah,
I have a friend that a little anecdote um, regarding the Dutch language. During World War II, the Dutch, because of how they pronounce certain words, they pull from. It's amazing to hear them when they do that. That it almost sounds like hacking, but it's just the way that they use their language. But in order to weed out German spies, they had a word. You would speak it in Dutch, and if you didn't pronounce it correctly, that's it.
yeah,
You're gone.
spectacular. God, I would
It's
love to
like
go there. I would
pretty
love to go
amazing.
there. Someday I'll
Yeah,
tell your friend
yeah,
if
I
you ever
should. It's
need
great.
if you ever need somebody to come over and give a talk, I'm ready.
It's been too long since I've been back. I'm ready. Let's go.
Yeah, we should.
But
We should.
so you mentioned a couple things. I mean, you didn't just practice attorney. You were. I mean, were you like assistant attorney general for the state of
Well,
Alaska at
yeah,
one point?
there was more than one assistant attorney general, but yeah. So when I went up to Alaska, I practiced law, and I did oil and gas, mining, environmental law, and it was really fun. I mean, Alaska's Alaska is what you think it is, and it was much more so then. It was empty. There was, very few people in Anchorage, 75,000. You wanted to do something, you did it. So one day I decided, hey, I saw a pizza oven for sale. I opened up a pizza place with a bunch of guys, and so we introduced pizza by the slice to Alaska, which was a lot of fun. But yeah, you could do it. You could do anything you wanted. You could even write a garden column as a lawyer, and so it was a great place to go to, and still is a wonderful place. And, yeah, it's great.
I mean, you even recently threw your hat in the ring. Speaking, we've touched on this a few times, not to get political, but you
Right.
were you were you were in the running for Congress, right? What motivated
Yeah,
you to
yeah.
do that?
Well, at the time, Don Young, our congressman, been a congressman ever since I've been in Alaska, which is a long time, and he passed away, and I decided, having the legal experience representing clients in natural resources and environmental, and I did a lot of law for the native corporations, which basically are the landowners of Alaska, and it just seemed like it was something I could do, and I didn't want Sarah Palin to win, and so I threw my hat in the ring, and I didn't realize there were going to be 51 other people. I didn't realize one of them was going to be named Santa Claus. I mean, who wouldn't vote for Santa Claus, and I didn't realize Sarah Palin was going to run, and I didn't realize there were going to be so many people that there wouldn't be forums where you can debate and argue and show a sense of humor and demonstrate that you've got capabilities. And so it was a very difficult thing to do. Fortunately, I should say, and I know we don't want to be too political, a terrific woman named Mary Patola, who was the first native to be elected to Congress, but the first native from Alaska, which is just something.
Mm.
I have to tell you, I've met a lot of politicians in my life. I have never met anybody as nice as this particular woman is. I can't tell you. It's a singular experience. It's like it was like meeting Dr. Elaine or meeting James. You go, whoa, these are really special people. So we're going to be in some good hands. It'll be very interesting, and I know she's a gardener, and I know her husband's a gardener, and that's what counts more than anything else. And
Yeah,
she's a
hopefully that
gardener in Alaska.
positivity and that type of attitude spreads in Washington D.C. because it can.
Yeah,
Oof,
yeah. Both the gardening attitude as well as the
right.
niceness attitude, and so we'll get there.
Yes.
We have to get there.
Yeah.
It's we got products like BioAg and stuff. They're people use and enjoy, and it doesn't matter whether you're red or blue. It doesn't make a bit of difference. It all works the same way, and that's what I keep coming back to. The soil food web is the system. There is no alternative reality when it comes to this stuff. This is the science. If you follow the science, you're going to come out ahead. It may take you, a couple of seasons. It may not, but ultimately, you're going to end up with a system. I believe it's going to be cheaper in terms of inputs. It's going to be truly regenerative, and by that I mean not just inputs into the garden, but regenerative in terms of your dealings with your employees, with your customers, it's your suppliers. It's all going to be a nice, healthy system, because we've all got a mission here, and that's the nice thing about it. Hopefully, it happens. We'll see.
Absolutely. Well, I think a lot of people's attitudes have changed. We recently interviewed a gentleman by the name of Jim Gale, Food Forest Abundance, where he's promoting permaculture, and their goal is to convert at least 50% of the lawns into permaculture. People producing their own foods. A lot of people are thinking about this, and I think COVID, I think the pandemic, a lot of people started gardening then. It's kind of decreased a little bit as far as the floral part of it, but as
Right,
far as home gardens, I, I think that continues. That people are going to continue to grow their own food and hopefully plant a row for the hungry. I
right.
will do that myself. I'm planning
Yeah,
to put in a garden. I've got a little spot set up. Even here in Arizona, we can garden at least during the winter time, and I'll do that the same because there's a farm, an urban farm, not too far away from here. It's called Riba Farms,
hmm,
and he's about on 1 or 2 acres, and it's right here in now it's kind of Santan Valley, Queen Creek, Arizona. Is kind of grown up around that, but it's great. And there's and our local subdivision Facebook group page has got a gardeners group, and so there's a lot of people who got gardens in
Yeah,
the
yeah,
backyard.
yeah,
I
yeah,
was in
absolutely.
Kansas recently visiting my family, and I've been gone for I moved away, gosh, almost 20 years ago, and so I've lived in the suburbs ever since, and you don't see a lot of gardens. But I was reminded of how prevalent a summertime garden is throughout the country in the backyards. Every place I went, the people I
Yeah,
would
it
go
is.
to see,
Yeah.
they garden in the backyard, and you just look down the street, you could see garden after garden. Like, yeah,
It
this
is
is
amazing. Yeah, I ride my bike around. Of course, in Anchorage, there's gardens everywhere. You can't turn around in a circle and not see a flower during the summertime. I mean, we're that crazy about we got to have the greenery during that 3 month period. But when I spend time down in Portland, I ride my bike around. I actually what I'm doing is I'm looking for fruits, street fruits. Trees people have planted. I got one little spot where there's some Concord grapes, and there's another spot with the plums. Um, these are truly organic because it's just dog pee and God knows what else is being used to grow these things. But uh, it is amazing how many people are growing vegetables. Yeah, flowers, you can kind of expect people to do that, and it makes such a big difference. It's We have an Australian neighbor. She's never gardened before. She's growing tomatoes. She will never go back to buying regular tomatoes. And that's just what it takes. It takes one at a time. One at a time. We'll get there. We'll get there. It's harder with farmers, but we'll get there. We have to. We have no choice.
another thing is, for anybody out there who hasn't started a garden yet, just remember they're plants.
Right.
Fail quickly. If it doesn't survive, try again.
Yep.
They're easy. They grow very easily. Just
They
try.
do.
Keep
And
trying.
and let them be in charge. Don't interfere too
Right.
much with them. I mean, I think that's the big. People like to fuss around and do this and that. You put your plant in, you roll your seeds in mycorrhizal fungi, you grow your seed into a seedling. If it's in the container, you grow it in the original container. If you got to transplant it, you roll the roots in mycorrhizal fungi, you plant it up, you mulch it properly so that you use a green mulch around vegetables and annuals. You use a brown mulch around trees and shrubs, and you let the microbes take over. And then you do much less work. You can sit and smell the flowers instead of having to futz around with them all the time. And it really is just such a big difference. And in terms of chemicals, uh, when I started writing my column, I was a chemical head, and I remember reading about a product called Saigon 2E, Cygon 2E. Should have known just from the wording. What does that mean, Saigon 2E? Um, it was something that the American Rose Society suggested that you paint around your uh, rose bushes. You could paint it around just a little strip around a branch or at the base of the plant. It was systemic. It would go in, and aphids would die if they hit the rose. Well, we had a serious aphid problem on all our birch trees, and so I came up with the idea that you just paint the stuff around your birch tree with a paintbrush. And I had people in Anchorage painting this stuff around their birch trees, and you could drive around town. You could see the trees that didn't have aphids on it because it worked like crazy, but you could also see this little strip around the birch tree. Well, the third or fourth year I did it, I happened to have a styrofoam cup, and I took the Saigon 2E and I poured it in the styrofoam cup, and I went to get my paintbrush in order to do the painting. The styrofoam cup disappeared in my hand. I suddenly realized, oh, this is not good. There were something like, I don't know, 14 or 15 different chemicals that I had been suggesting people use over the first 15 or 20 of my column that were removed by the chemical companies themselves, the producer. So really, really something. It's amazing when a company itself pulls a product off the market because it's no good.
Yeah,
So we'll get there. We're going to get there. It's a sort
we're
of,
getting there.
yeah,
Yep.
indeed.
So, what maybe one of my last questions is, of your books, should people read them sequentially, or is there, do you have a recommended order and maybe which people should check them out or follow
Yeah.
through now that you have a
Yeah.
quadrilogy?
Well, I would certainly start with Teeming with Microbes. And then I used to tell people that they should read Teeming with Fungi, which is the third book. I think now Teeming with Microbes and then Teeming with Bacteria. Although, the bacteria feed the plants, so do the fungi, which is both, they're both important. Teeming with nutrients, again, is sort of something I wrote for myself because I just found it fascinating. I still do. It's not so much. It's not so much about how the nutrients are produced. It's much more about how they're used by the plant. So I would put that one last. So I'd go team with microbes, team with bacteria, team with fungi, and then team with nutrients. Will there be another
There
one? I don't think so. To write one of these books, you got to go down into the hole. You have to study like crazy. I mean, I must have read 10,000 papers. Everything James White wrote, all these papers from China, there were about 10 or 15 people that you can track. You get one side and then you have to just read that stuff, and fascinating stuff, and how it all develops, and how it's disseminated. I mean, I was dumbfounded. We've always had the suspicion that when you use chemicals, the bacteria use in the plant, the nitrogen efficiency, bacterial nitrogen efficiency in the plant goes down. You get an impact on the nitrogen being produced. Who knew? Some little paragraph in a little teeny paper. Whoa, we've been talking about, there's the proof, and there's 4 citations to it. So one of the things I tell people with regard to this last book is that in the appendices, I list a series of papers they may want to read. There's even 1 or 2 websites where you can look at films of, for example, the root hair growing and forming. Really freaky stuff, where oscillations occurring, and things that only a scientist would get to see because they're the only ones exposed to it. So hopefully the bottom line on these books is that it exposes you to enough science, teaches you enough of the lingo that you can continue to study this stuff. I have in my internet Google search engines search instructions to search for soil food web, rhizophagy, bacteria, soil, certain key words. And I get notices when a paper comes out that's picked up by the Google AI system, and plow my way through some of these papers. And if you're serious about this stuff and enjoy the books, that's the next step. Getting into the real source scientific stuff and following the stuff as it continues to be developed. There are so many more discoveries with regard to rhizophagy, so many more discoveries with regard to endophytic bacteria and endosymbiosis, that people like James are going to be busy forever. And what a delightful guy. You had him on the show, didn't you?
Yeah, he's great. We had a really great time, and
He's
we were able
terrific.
to run through a presentation of his and see a lot of the images and videos.
Right.
It was great. It was
Right,
great.
right. Yeah, his
One,
images are just fabulous.
yeah, it's great research. It's moving everything in the right direction, and there's so many people involved in it. It's exciting. It's an exciting time.
It is.
I wanted to
Definitely
take a minute, Jeff, and just thank you for your books. You break things down to where people can understand the soil food web, and it's been a mission of yours. I just wanted to thank you for that,
Yeah, my
because
pleasure.
guys like me who came out of conventional ag and still thinking that way, it's a translation to the reality of the soil food web. Just thank you for that mission
Yeah,
that you have accomplished. Thank you.
well, my pleasure. And again, what I try to do is break it down so that I can understand it. I know if I can understand it, anybody can. And so I try to break it down into simple little bites. And you can imagine with a thing like bacteria, for example. Phew, they're not simple. I mean, there's some pretty incredible things, and you have to decide what are you going to put in, what are you not going to put in. there are these special viruses called phages, which attach themselves to bacteria, change their chromosomes. I didn't even mention them. There are a couple of things I refuse to get into because they're so complicated. I can't simplify them, like the Krebs cycle. I refuse to list the Krebs cycle. And in fact, I don't think in any of my books I have any chemical formulas. They're too goddamn complicated.
It takes talent. It takes talent and skill to make the
I think,
complicated not complicated.
well, it takes a lot more
Yeah, I will
intelligence
echo
than
that
I
as
have
well.
to be able to pick this stuff up and instantly understand it. And so I had to break it down in order to be able to write about it. And so the first half of all of my books is, okay, look, hold your nose. Let's just get through this stuff, and then we can get into the good stuff. And it's no different with teaming with bacteria because, again, these are things we don't really know about, don't study. So thank you very much. But I do it for myself. I'm very selfish. I'm not doing it for you, but I'm glad it helped.
Yeah,
Very good.
we all get to benefit from your selfishness.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you. Thank you. And again,
Wonderful.
as you know, you can hardly shut me up if people are listening to this, and particularly if they live far, far away, and I can fly there and have a wonderful trip. Let me know. I'll come and give a talk. I love talking about this stuff. I have bunches of really pretty funny talks because that's the other thing you were talking about. How do you got to use a sense of humor? This isn't funny stuff. This is pretty serious stuff. But if you can make it a little bit humorous, maybe you can convince that serious farmer, to get into this stuff.
Mhm.
It's important to do.
It keeps people, maintains their attention.
Yeah, well, again, if you're giving a talk and they're laughing at what you're saying, not at you, but at what you're saying, they're understanding it. And so that's very, very important. That's one of the hard things about writing a book. You don't know whether people are understanding it until after you've written that book, and Amazon has their claws into it. I got because they sell the books.
I was going through Amazon and looking at the books last evening, Jeff, and I can tell you, I think all of them, if not all of them, had 5-star reviews.
Oh yeah,
And
yeah, that's
so
pretty amazing.
people receive these books very well. And if you don't have copies, get copies. I have 3 of them. I've yet to place a pre-order for the newest one, but it will be on my bookshelves soon. I encourage everybody else to check them out, or get the audio.
Don't wait. Don't wait. You don't want them to run out. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
they
right.
do.
Hurry! Supplies last.
Yeah, I'm sure my publisher, again, Timber Press got bought out by presses. There's consolidation in the publishing field, and so they're still in existence, but they're just owned by bigger companies. And so now they're owned by a company. I think it's called HBS. It's like the 3rd largest publisher in the world, and has all these sub-publishing things and whatnot. I'm pretty convinced they have no idea about the soil food web. I hope somebody there is reading it so that they don't say, "What are we carrying this book for?" Get rid of that one. We'll see. And then my goal is Chinese. I finally got it in Spanish. Now I want it in Chinese. Then I'll be ready to just throw the pen away. I think this would be an important subject for China to embrace. We've got Romania, Ukraine, Lithuania, Poland, Turkey, Brazil, Portuguese being translated into Portuguese. We need Chinese, and then we'll own the world.
Yeah, absolutely.
Get everybody off. Yep. Well, fellas,
Wonderful.
What else you need?
I think we've covered a lot of ground. We really appreciate your time and joining us on this episode, Jeff. It's been great. I'd love to have you back at some point, maybe especially if things change, or new technology comes out, or where you learn something in the science. But
Sure.
Nevertheless, thank you so much for carving out some time to visit with us. Greatly appreciated.
A real pleasure.
Best
I
of luck with
love BioAg. I love BioAg products. Don't buy my books. Buy BioAg because BioAg products support the microbes. They team with the microbes, and you won't be disappointed. That's for sure. I think I've been using Humisolve in my compost tea mix since the first tea I ever made, actually. So that goes back 25 years or so. Amazing. Absolutely
Yep.
amazing.
Well, you heard it from Jeff, everybody, by BioAg.
Yeah. Oh, no question about it. I mean, and I'm not just saying that. It's just a coincidence that I ran into Vic, for example. Um, I think I was on Bob Faust's. Did he used to live in Hawaii? He may have lived in Hawaii at one time, but I was
Yes.
on Bob Faust's show back when he was in Hawaii. So how long ago was that? So this is my repeat performance. When the first book came out, I think Bob had me on. It's kind of fun.
Yeah, wonderful.
Super. Well, you guys are terrific, and I will come back
Thank you.
anytime you want. And say, buy the books, buy BioAg, go organic, soil food web regenerative, whatever you want to call it. It's the only way to go.
I think we'll end there. That was great. Bill, any last words?
No, I just don't know where the last hour and a half went. We could do this all day, Jeff. Really, really
Good.
appreciate you. Thank you.
Super, 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 super. Anytime, let me know.
Will do. Thank
All
you.
right.
Take care.
We got it. Say hello to everybody.
Will do.
What a guy.
What a guy. That was quite a conversation.
Yeah. And he has the gift of gab.
He does. He does.
For great guests.
Yeah, these super smart guys that have way more information in their brains than they can get out. I always learn so much from, having Dr. White on, similar. I feel like we could sit all day and ask Jeff about different parts of, his work on the soil food web and what he's learned. And it's endless.
Yeah. And being able to create analogies, it is like the tofu example that people making the complicated not complicated. It takes skill. There's a talent to that.
Yeah, and I get it. And I will never forget that tofu package again.
I almost want to go out and try
picturing
some tofu.
the bacteria just backing into it, being manipulated to become part of the plant's food source.
Yeah, I think I know that smell of butyric acid in a different from a different experience. But yeah, some of those organic acids. Oh, dude.
Oh, dude.
Oh, that smells so bad.
I still couldn't help myself as Jeff was talking about, the soil food web, the work that Elaine Ingham has done to communicate that, but still not having the ability to translate that, into big ag, at scale. And that will be the challenge going forward. There's a better understanding now of the fact what we've done over the last, 60, 70 years of ag in the US, what we've done, what we've created, kind of created a monster. We have to get back to the soil food web. And, the one thing he said, the soil food web is the system. There is no other. And, for him on a gardener scale, organic gardener scale, CSA scale, town garden scale, it all makes perfect sense. But it's this big ag model, this big industry that kind of drives itself. And until, is it a top-down model that it's going to take? What do you think, Johann? Do you think legislation is going to happen? Do you think big players at the top are going to change it? What do you think?
Unfortunately, I should say unfortunately, but yeah, I think there will be. I hope that's not the case, because I who wants to be told what to do or legislated into doing something, right? I don't think that's necessarily ideal, because a lot of things have been done with the good intentions that don't end up being working out. So that's why to me I'd rather see it from the bottom up in this case. I'd rather see the early adopters I'd rather see, the guys meeting down. Like there's this great cafe down in Buckeye, Arizona called the Sheep Camp. And it's where all the farmers meet, have, their breakfast and coffee and what have you. And they serve they serve some good breakfast. But, just farmers speaking with each other and having those early adopters take on and spread the message versus being legislated. The timing of it, and he says, 60 years of soil left. I'm like, I don't know, dude, can we really measure what, I mean, yeah. How many times have we said, hey, we only have 5-10 more years of useful planet left, and then we're dust? It's like, it's like,
Right.
How do you measure that? I think the takeaway from that is, hey, we can't continue down this path. This is unsustainable. This isn't working, and it's happening. Look at all the different companies now that have biostimulants, and I think they're working on safer chemistry. Yet at the same time, and regardless of what some of the companies are doing, farmers are taking on that regenerative approach. Not long ago, I saw an article on cover crops in corn. When I grew up, well, when I was younger, because you ask my wife, it's debatable whether I've grown up. But as a child in Kansas, I can recall running down the corn rows, right? And you've got the crop canopy once it's closed, and you have these rows you can run down, and it's just bare soil with the occasional weed, right? Looking back on that, it's wasted space, so to speak. There's things that we can be doing. Cover crops being one of them, right? And then, the whole it was starting to kind of go that way with organic. It sounded like maybe organic's the only. That's not the only solution. We've got how many people, and we don't have arable land everywhere. Look at Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates and those places. That they, in order for people to survive there, they have to have greenhouse agriculture, or at least a modified structure in which they can grow foods in a controlled or manipulated environment. And in some places, it just comes down to survival.
Sure.
We have a luxury here in this country where we have, having visited all but 5 states in the union, tremendous. There's things that we just don't think about. And unless you live in the ghetto, you're not thinking food deserts. Like, food deserts do exist here in the United States. So how do you get food to those locations? And in that case, I think controlled environment agriculture is a solution. Is it the solution? I don't know if any one of them is the solution, which is why I say is it A, B, C, or D? No, it's E. It's everything. It's all of the above. And can we convert more of the, you and I've talked about this, the conventional, what does conventional mean? Is it all, salt-based fertilizers and pesticides? I don't think anybody's 100% conventional anymore. Maybe they are. I don't know. But we're chipping away at that, and hopefully we're moving. The momentum is building fast enough that we'll see bigger changes. Like you mentioned, no farmer intentionally destroyed their soil. They may do some harm to their soil. It's not intentional. Just like with pesticides. I've never met a farmer who says, I can't wait to go out there and spray this pesticide.
No.
It's it's that time of year. I have this. I don't want to lose my crop. I have to spray for this. Show me a better way and I'll do it.
Unfortunately, you made a statement there a little bit ago about survival. Okay, so high volume production systems to survive, right? Need enough food to survive. Unfortunately, all these big acre farms, row crop farms, even locally here in the Willamette Valley, grains, grasses for seed, hazelnut, and then some other stuff. Farmers are one crop away from being broke. They have to cover that operating loan this year. They're not going to be in business next year. So whatever moves you make, they got to fit into an income budget. That's the tough part is, you want to commit to a full season of covers to build your soil. Where's the income off those acres? How's that going to fit into your budget next year? You're not going to have the income you need to make your payment on that tractor that Jeff
well, maybe that's where the legislation comes in, right? Maybe that's where it's like, hey, if there were the incentive, the carrot. Yep. It's just like with cash, land rent. I've met many farmers who say, well, I rent this land. Why do I want to spend the additional investment in building a soil that I may not be farming next season?
That's so true.
So that's where I'm like, okay, this idea, even the carbon credit markets and even like that's not an overnight thing. That's like a 3 to 5 year commitment, right? So it's like, how do we do the right thing? But yet, there's the dollars attributed to that as well. And what about alternative crops, right? You said, so much of it is determined by corn and beans. Well, I'm sure a lot of those farmers are like, well, what are my choices? Show me another choice. Is it hemp? I don't know if that's necessarily the answer. Maybe from a fiber standpoint. But what about other crops? And gosh, I read an article not too long ago that was saying that we as a society, I may have been just to the United States, we rely on a couple dozen crops that sustain us. However, you look at potatoes, for example, how many different types of tomatoes are there? How many different types of carrot-like crops are there? The crops that could substitute carrots but are native to, say, Africa, and they're highly drought tolerant, right? It's like, do we, if there are people out there researching that right now, how do we grow? How do we expand the markets to include those crops? There's nothing against alternative sources of protein, but I'm not too keen on eating insects yet.
Not many are. But yeah, well, in that whole, the feedlot system, that livestock being an active part of regenerating soils, that's been taken away. It's too complicated to build fences and run cattle anymore, or livestock, period. But there are so many little changes, incentives, that regen soil certification that I think that group's in Kentucky, but they're actually getting some better returns for their farmers, if they implement 2 out of 6 principles of regenerative. And that's going to be slow. But I think a carrot, in the form of tax relief from the state at the state level, I think that could really help farmers that want to take out. They want to, like my son, for example. Wes is over here. He's had the same variety of annual ryegrass on this 80 acres for, golly, we're probably 5 years in now, which is fine. But it's farmed annually. We no-tilled it a couple years. But he's like, I got to do something different there. Well, what's he going to do? He still has to generate a crop there next year, but he knows he needs to do something with that soil. And so now we're talking about maybe interseeding, a multi-species cover through the winter that could, it'll freeze out or it'll be insignificant come springtime. He'll still have a crop to harvest. But it's like a guy like him, he's got to pay, he's got to cover his operating loans. He's got equipment payments. He can't just, do the right thing because it's the right thing. He's got to generate income. And that's the tough part. But yeah, I think, the carrot from the government could be really helpful for those kind of early adopters, those guys. Yeah.
That and education, as we were talking, like, well, how do we do this? It's like education.
Right.
I think we hit on this in one of the earlier episodes, education. Oh, I think it was with John, educating the consumer so they understand where their food comes from. Like, I don't know what the stat was. It was pretty impressive. Don't quote me on this, but something like 70% of television ad space is pharmaceuticals.
That would not
Right.
surprise me.
Like, when I'd much rather see a 30-second spot or a minute spot on TV about, educating people on how to, food.
The soil food web.
Yeah. How many times you ever walked into a grocery store and had a coupon for fruit or vegetable? I don't fully understand
Never.
how coupons work,
Right.
right?
No,
But
that's
yeah, it's like, how do you incentivize people to eat healthier? How do you change that mindset? You give people, coupons for, Lucky Charms. Although don't get me wrong, I like a bowl of Lucky Charms every now and again, but not, you know, every day. That's not my main breakfast choice. Right.
right.
But you got coupons and people are like, well, I've only got so much money to I gotta buy the food, right? I gotta
Mm,
eat. And
mm,
so, it's education. And I think the same thing goes with, farmers is not to say that they're not educated. That's not what I'm saying. It's disseminating that information farther and wider
mm.
to more farms. And then, of
Right.
course, then, of course, it's going to come right back to I'm aware of that. So what? I still have to pay the loan.
Right.
Still got to pay the bank. Still got to make those payments. Still have to do this or that. Got to have, got to be in the black in my checking account, right?
Yeah, that's the tough one because I'm not a big government guy. No, that's ridiculous. I think half the farm bill is kind of a bad idea anyway to incentivize that system to continue. But in this case, I think something would be useful to encourage those guys, encourage the early adopters and the uneducated. Educate the uneducated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But thankfully, we have people like Jeff who 47 years, never missed a week.
Yeah, that's impressive. That's super. That is a model of life consistency.
Mm-hmm.
And clearly a healthy mind and always learning. Did you see how he was just geeking out on the papers he'd read and Dr. White's work? And it's just like a kid,
Mm-hmm.
a kid seeing that for the first time.
Yeah, seeing it with childlike enthusiasm.
Yeah, that's a lesson for all of us. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. One thing he didn't go into, which he did in another episode I was watching. As I was doing background research and stuff, and he was on an interview with another podcast, I think, or YouTube channel or something like that. Anyway, he had explained where in going through this research, he said, okay, I am a bacteria. So he's like, that's a good visualization. Put yourself into, okay, I'm a bacteria. Now I'm in the soil and I smell popcorn and, like, oh, that, like the butyric acid or something like that. Oh, I'm attracted to the plant now. Okay, now I'm a plant cell. And I was like, that's a really good way. Visualize, put yourself, you are the bacteria, right? And picture it. Like, that's a good idea.
No, that's genius. Can you imagine the series of children's books that could be built around that? Maybe they're already out there.
Not only that, but so my son, he's in high school and, does the online schooling, but spends a couple days a week, at a physical location. When they took a tour of the ASU campus, and they now have on the main campus a virtual reality learning experience. So I'm thinking, that's how we can, instead of some of these games are cool and all, but for like educational purposes, strap on the old goggles, and now you are in the rhizosphere, and you're in, and that is a learning experience. So now you can take Jeff's "I am a bacteria." Well, with virtual reality, you can be a bacteria. You can be this observer in the rhizosphere and experience that, the bacterium backing up and being digested, seeing the ROS hit the bacteria. That can be created and done visually, not just in 2D, but in 3D or even 4D. They went on this field trip. My son went on this field trip earlier this week to see this facility, and in one of the examples, they're in an alien zoo, so they get taken up into a spaceship, and it happens to be a zoo. Well, one of the creatures spits or something like that, and while they have their goggles on, they get sprayed with water, or something like that. So there's a kind of this. So you could be a bacteria, right? And then all of a sudden, the plant, hits you with some ROS, and now all of a sudden you're dissolving and you're the stuff into the plant. So yeah, it's coming. Who knows? But it could be done.
And it's so important. Well, hey, I think we're about the end of our time here.
I think we are.
I think they're going
to. So with that, we'll leave it there.
All right.
Signing off.
All the best to you.
3, 2, 1.